And that's cognitive training in itself, right? You're scanning the environment, you're inhibiting a response. Do I fire or do I not fire? You don't need to isolate that and put it on a screen to train it. It's expertise, we always say, is domain specific. That means an expert is only an expert in context. They are an expert in situ. If you don't put them in that context, they are no longer experts. They're actually training a different task.
Welcome back, Lake Tech Nation. We got a pretty awesome one for you. We're diving into a little bit of cognitive performance based on popular request. Drew, who are we talking to?
We've got Job Fransen. Job is a skill acquisition specialist working at the University Medical Centre Groningen, which I probably mispronounced, located in the Netherlands. He's an adjunct fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney School of Sport, Exercise, and Rehabilitation. He's conducted research into how skill acquisition is optimized in athletes. He's worked with high-performance athletes and individuals from around the world across elite sport, esports, military, gaming. He is also a skill acquisition consultant, assisting some of the world's best coaches to design practice that optimizes learning across a range of sports, most notably, which makes sense because he's Australian and Dutch, rugby, Australian football, soccer, and basketball. You will hear him say this in the episode, and we will include it in the show notes. He wants folks to reach out to him. He wants people to engage. He wants to spread the work that he is doing and kind of open up his research to get as many folks involved. So we'll have that contact information in the show notes for you guys.
Yeah, we first got interested in his work because of a preprint he's got out. Really interesting content. Just the title is pretty straight up. It tells you what it's about. There is no evidence for a far transfer of cognitive training to sport performance.
None.
And I was curious about this because one of the first things I ran into as I tried to learn a little bit about the cognitive performance realm is the idea of near transfer versus far transfer. And I won't ruin it because we're going to get into what that is in the episode, and Job defines it much better than I can. But he does a pretty good job in this preprint of laying out kind of where the evidence is at and trying to address kind of something that I think the public has been somewhat misled on in the whole idea of like brain games and things like that. So we dive into it here. And like Drew said, he's not messing around with letting people contact him. The cover page for the preprint has both his email address and his Twitter handle. He's getting it out there so he can have these conversations and influence this space and try and point people in the right direction. So if this is something that you're working on, something you're interested in, he talks about it in the episode. If you need somebody to like point you in the right direction to get started, he's happy to do that.
We only got one person in trouble.
It wouldn't matter that much to me. We have a lot of academic freedom, so.
Must be nice. I guess this can be like the opener question, but Alex and I were talking about this because I've been around NeuroTracker specifically, but a lot of things like NeuroTracker for so long and did not even know that near transfer and far transfer were things. Can you like basically define those and explain what that is before we obviously dive into a critique about the concepts?
Yeah. So whenever you practice anything, the aim is to transfer it, right? You want to transfer it to another scenario. For example, in sport, you practice on the field, and then you want something to show up in competitive games later on. So near transfer would be when you practice an activity, and the activity that you want to transfer it to is very much related to the activity that you were practicing. For example, if your practice is to remember random number digits, right? And then you have some random number digit remembering task that you are transferring it to, that would be near transfer. Far transfer would be when both tasks are relatively remote or unrelated. So for example, if you'd say, oh, I'm going to practice the same, random number remembering, and I'll be a better chess player. Both have some cognitive components, but they are so far removed from one another that if you were to transfer practice performance or learning from that one task to the other, we would call that far transfer.
I'm going to do a quick aside here for the audience just to like lay out some terms and things. Like just like fitness, kind of like physical fitness has components, right? Like aerobic capacity, muscular strength, power, speed, whatever. The same framework applies to cognitive performance, cognitive skill stuff. So like Some examples being perceptual cognitive skill, attentional control, reaction time, hand-eye coordination, working memory. Those are like broad categories of cognitive performance. And essentially what he's laying out is just because you train that category of cognitive performance, if you train it on an actual task that's completely different from where you want to apply it, the literature does not provide a lot of evidence that you can expect that component to transfer over, even though like if I make you stronger on a deadlift and improve your lower body strength, you can pretty well expect that to transfer over to other lower body strength things, even if they're not deadlifts. The same is not necessarily true. Specificity is much more important on the cognitive side, is what the overall idea I'm getting here is.
That's right. And a good example of that is, imagine, you've got children and they've got a chess teacher in school. Someone who does extracurricular activity says, oh, you should be doing chess because chess improves your intelligence. So they go to chess class, they do that for 2 years, but it doesn't change their intelligence, right? That far transfer is way too difficult to achieve, even though everyone has the idea that people who play chess are relatively intelligent. Right? So there's often this weird misunderstanding that if we train one thing, that we can just transfer it to whatever you want, even if that's a very remote task to the one we are training. And that's even more so in the cognitive domain, because we don't have the same amount of understanding of how far apart some of these cognitive abilities actually are.
This is kind of the $1 million question, but is there even such thing as far transfer?
There is, yes. There are some studies, of course, that demonstrate far transfer, but I would say, and this is me basing some of this on the psychological literature, the overall evidence for a far transfer is what we would say in the research literature null. It means almost non-existent or non-existent. There's actually no evidence for far transfer between those cognitive domains that are relatively remote. Interestingly, though, it is something that is marketed so heavily. So maybe a good thing is here to just paint a picture of where this all started for me. So I do, outside of my regular academic work, I do a lot of consultancy for organizations. They're usually sporting organizations. And one of the questions I get asked most is, hey, we've got this company here. They've got a new technology. Their salespeople are trying to sell it to us. They say that it does all these amazing things. Usually it's some sort of cognitive task that then transfers to on-field performance. And they ask me to sit with these organizations rather than them, because I have a more critical view of the claims that they are making. And I was getting so much demand, so many people asking me, and it was a different company each single time, right? And they were all trying to sell the same thing, which I knew there was no evidence for. They were all claiming outrageous evidence for their own tools, which I'm sure was from some sort of internal or biased research. And then they were trying to sell that to people who don't know any better, usually athletic departments of sporting teams who don't really have the same scrutiny when it comes to trying to understand cognitive training. So that's where it all started for me. And I said, look, I'm going to focus on this a little bit, even though the evidence from the psychological literature is overwhelming that a far transfer is extremely, extremely difficult to achieve. In sport or in physical performance or in athletic performance, we don't seem to get that.
And for this audience, I'll mention that he specifically identified sporting teams, departments, institutions, all that kind of stuff. But since the military takes a lot of cues from sports and sports takes a lot of cues from the military, they very much operate in the same way. Drew mentioned NeuroTracker at the beginning. NeuroTracker appears to be used by the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, the EPL, US military. And I know one of the papers that Job sent to us in the initial conversation was on NeuroTracker specifically. So I'm gonna tee up a chance for him to talk about NeuroTracker here for a second.
So the argument here is always logical, right? The argument that comes from sport, and it's always the same. We go, hey, in sport, it's really important to have this divided attention. You should be able to track multiple opponents at the same time. And I guess we can draw a parallel to military performance, right? You have to pay attention to multiple tasks at the same time, perhaps tracking multiple enemies at the same time or multiple teammates, etc. And then our our logical reasoning is then, given that you have to do that on the field, let's find a task that measures it, right? Or that trains it. And then we go all the way back and we say, oh, here's this computer task where you've got some circles moving around on the screen, and then you've got to track multiple of these circles, and then identify which of the circles were moving in the first place. Or were flashing in the first place. But the distance between this task on a computer screen and the actual application of that task in the field is so far away that the causal reasoning of one leads to another, it's way too far-fetched. There are so many multiple steps in between that we are just completely ignoring and throwing out of the window. And in a way, I can understand, right? Because there are so many organizations that are providing, and I don't always want to say false evidence, because sometimes in their eyes, this is good evidence, but when it's scrutinized by the scientific literature, all of a sudden it doesn't really hold up that well, which you can see for NeuroTracker in sport, but also some of Salah's papers for anyone who's interested on brain training or cognitive training in the psychological literature. All of a sudden, that evidence is actually not that strong anymore. And it's just, for me, it is difficult to understand why we don't just take a breather and say, hey, wait a second, perhaps expertise is very domain specific. We know expertise is domain specific, right? When we look at the best experts, they are good in one single thing. And when you ask them anything outside of that, I think the best example of that is I was talking to a memory expert, and he said to me, look, like, I'm amazing at memorizing stuff, right? Decks of cards, random digits, etc. But my wife asks me to bring 20 things from the shop and I forget 7. So I can't remember that. So the domain specificity of expertise is so great that it's actually a logical argument to say that one doesn't transfer to the other, but it doesn't seem like that for sport or for other domains, like, for example, military performance, but also a lot of the cognitive testing batteries you would do if you want to do a new job, right? And they make you tests and they measure all kinds of executive functions before you are even given the job. There's no relationship between how well you score there and how well you do that job, how happy you are at that work, etc.
So I'll lay out one, because every time I bring up, especially if you see the term brain training, the first thing that people mention is Lumosity, because they've seen the ads for it. It was like everywhere for a couple of years there, back in like the 2013 to 2016 timeframe. And I'm just going to read this off straight from the lawsuit stuff. Lumosity agreed to a $50 million settlement, although it actually ended up, they only paid like $2 million, which was less than 10% of their annual revenue at the time, which is kind of interesting. But it was a deceptive advertising suit where, along with the $2 million they paid, they were ordered not to make any claims anymore that its products can improve performance in school, at work, or in athletics, that their products can delay or protect against age-related decline in memory or cognitive function, including mild cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's, or that their products could reduce cognitive impairment caused by health conditions, all claims that they had been making for a while. And it turns out that the only evidence they had was that their brain games make you better at those games. But by the time the lawsuit happened, they had already received $70 million of venture capital funding. They already had a grant from the U.S. Navy to enhance sailor performance. And although, yes, their revenue has declined since that stuff kind of got discussed publicly, as of 2020, they're still reporting like 100 million users and still making north of $10 million a year in revenue.
And this is a very smart thing, right? Because I'll go back to the chess bit. If your neighbor's kids are doing chess class and the chess teacher is saying, yeah, but if they do chess class, they're more intelligent, they score higher on their whatever tests and they get into better unis, you have to be very, very strong as someone who doesn't understand which scientific evidence there is for and against these tools. You have to be very, very strong and very understanding of that literature to then say, oh, I won't send my kid because I don't think this is true. And this is one of the reasons why I felt it was needed that because I wrote some of this work up in a preprint originally. And maybe for the viewers who are less familiar with that, a preprint is actually a working paper. It's something that you submit to the scientific world out there and that they can scrutinize. It doesn't go to a journal. It doesn't get reviewed by peer reviewers, but the scientific environment actually gets to read it and tell me what they think about it. But I felt so strongly about writing that up quickly and putting it out there because I was getting more and more stories of people who weren't sure what the evidence was, and because they didn't want to miss out, they just went for it anyway. Right? I'll buy the brain training app. I'll do the chess training. I'll send my kid to violin school because it's supposed to help them get better cognitively. And like I worked with the military for a while as well. There are plenty of cognitive training projects that are funded in the military as well, right? Or in the military space or research space.
Well, there's this kind of like, I mean, because like I said, I've been around that stuff before, and it almost, you're right, becomes one of those things that like, oh, I heard this other organization was doing it, we should do it too. And I mean, some of these companies leverage that in their advertising, like we mentioned, hey, we work with the NFL, we work with so I guess you highlighted this in one of the papers that you wrote, and we've had folks on here before that have talked about, I'll use the term predatory, especially when we took it like the supplement industry or the nutrition industry, where there is actually a danger involved in some of the stuff that things are claiming they can do. I guess the question here is the issue, I wouldn't imagine that like Lumosity, for example, doing brain training, whatever that means, it's not dangerous, but it gets it valuable training time. And I think you mentioned that in your paper. I'd just be interested to hear you speak to that, because one of the things that I have conversations with coaches all the time is it's less about inflicting harm and more about this conversation around, if you have an hour to work with somebody, and because they're in the military, you only get that hour, a couple of times a week, you could put them in front of something like NeuroTracker for 30 minutes and think that you've done something because they can press the button enough times or identify enough dots. But the issue here is that the literature does not show that that's even doing anything. And that's the issue I think that we're scratching at, is it becomes a matter of training time that you're taking up by playing these games.
Absolutely. And my background is actually as a skill acquisition specialist. So my role or my job is actually to find out how can we maximize training time, right? How can we optimize training quality? And one way to not do that is by engaging in these things which we know don't transfer. Then you're better off resting, because there's more evidence for taking a nap or resting a little bit on performance than it is to have another cognitive training session at the end. And there's a second issue as well. So there's the training time issue, and the second issue, which is highlighted really well in some of these psychological papers, which is that scientific funding, right? Scientific funding for cognitive training programs should no longer be done or no longer be allowed, because what it actually does is it takes valuable resources away, resources that are paid for by the community, by the taxpayer. These valuable resources are taken away to then investigate something that we already know doesn't work. And the harm in that is much, much greater, because what it does is it takes away from other research that might be on, let's say, in a military setting, on equipment, right? And how does the equipment make the operatives safer? That's much more valuable research than spending millions on cognitive training if we already know it doesn't work. And that's the other big thing. And then the third thing is, a lot of people use that argument, right? They say to me, yeah, but you're talking about an NFL team. They've got money enough. They're just trying to see what the next best thing, and if it doesn't work, they throw it away. But what we can't forget, that these are also role models for society, right? If they do it, it's on Instagram. If they do it, it's on Twitter. If they do it, it's on Facebook. That means that some person whose son wants to be the next, person in the special forces, right, might actually go and buy some of these things because the army is doing it as well. And if the army is doing it, I might as well prepare my son because he wants to go into the army. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because these people are not playing with the same resources than big organizations are. And it comes down to the fairness of science, right? Science is for the community. And if we don't do it for the community, we shouldn't do it at all.
Is this industry, I mean, is there any truth to any of it, or is this whole thing, this idea of, hey, play this game and you'll be able to kick more soccer ball? Like, is it the whole thing just based on like shams, or does anything in this space actually do anything cognitively?
Before Job answers, I was hoping to like frame up this because there has been drama in this space, right? Like there are people on both sides of the issue. There is some research indication of various things, right? And so as I was preparing, I read a piece that I'm sure you're familiar with, and it talks about two letters that are easy to find on the cognitive training data website, which, disclaimer, there's some interesting formatting differences on that page. The rebuttal letter includes all the awards every author's ever won, but the original letter does not, et cetera. It's a little strange, but I'll just quote from the paper that analyzes the two letters. It says, in 2014, two groups of scientists published open letters on the efficacy of brain training interventions or brain games for improving cognition. I'll editorialize here briefly. The original letter was from the Stanford Center on Longevity, and the follow-up one was from a team assembled through cognitive training data. And the first one was by 70 scientists claiming brain games do not provide a scientifically grounded way to improve cognitive functioning or stave off cognitive decline. And then a few months later, a letter written by 133 scientists and practitioners, so scientists and people in the industry, countered that the literature is replete with demonstrations of the benefits of brain training for a wide variety of cognitive and everyday activities. How then do these large bodies of pretty established researchers come to such opposing conclusions? And I'll let Job answer in more detail, but my take on it is they don't disagree as much as it sounds like they do. If you actually read the letters, they agree on most stuff, but I'll let Job take it away.
Yeah, and this is actually, I mean, for those who are interested, this is actually in Giovanni Sala's work. This is discussed at length. And this debate happens all the time. When I submit papers, it happens all the time as well. And I think there are definitely different things at play. So one is, what establishes a body of evidence? Like, when can you speak of a body of evidence? For example, in the sport world, when I submit things and I say, well, there's no evidence for cognitive training's far transfer to performance, then people say, hey, but what about this paper, this single paper that's kind of obscure, that's published somewhere with a limited sample size, etc. The idea here is that the research quality has to be high enough, right? And the body of evidence has to be great enough before you can actually speak of evidence. The second thing is that I think a lot of and I'm speaking in the sports world, of course, these people, and again, you can go to the database and you can have a look. I think there's about 150 papers quoted or cited there that provide evidence for cognitive training in the psychological literature, which is, I mean, a lot of that evidence is refuted in later work. But in the sports literature, I think also the people who are making the arguments for the value of cognitive training have what's called confirmation bias, right? And when their work is disproven, they get this cognitive dissonance. All of a sudden, right, their work is disproven, so they try everything possible to interpret the results in such a way that they're not actually that harmful. And I think we really have to watch out for that. So the first thing is, and I fully understand the public cannot make the same. I mean, they don't have time like me to sit behind the screen and read and scrutinize things. So the public doesn't have the same level of scrutiny of this work. But we need to be aware of the fact that not everything that is published is high quality work, right? For example, in this list of cited work, there are also pieces of work that don't actually have original work in them, like meta-analyses or systematic reviews, which in themselves can provide a high level of evidence, but they don't bulk up the number of evidence, right? You have to take them out. And then there's studies in there that are supposed to be intervention trials where there's no appropriate control group, for example, which means you already can't make causal inferences, which is what we are doing here. We are saying that cognitive training causes, far transfer. And that is even much more so in the sporting literature, where here we have a much bigger issue in sport right now, because we have much less ammo to say that it doesn't work, just because not a lot of work has been produced, right? We can't summarize all of these findings in let's say a meta-analysis and say, hey, overall in sport, this doesn't work. Now it's up to you to prove that it does. So these little bits of evidence here and there that people are using from obscure studies or low quality studies, and they're saying, hey, wait a second, but my tool, that I've tested internally works. So now this NFL team and these people have to buy it because it does work. Here is evidence for it. That evidence is not actually evidence in a scientific manner whatsoever.
To that point, though, I guess, having seen these things be used, you always do kind of ask that question of like, how are you going to tell if this works? Like, are they going to come back from the mission or come off the field and, I've made more tackles or I've, been more accurate. I don't know what it would even look like. So if the athlete has the perception that something has changed, because I've seen that happen too, where, guys will be clicking on the screen and doing stuff, and then they'll come back a week later and be like, oh, I felt a difference in whatever. I guess my question is, as a consultant, have you had to argue against that when, a GM or whatever has heard an athlete say that it's had an effect, but we know from a peer-reviewed research standpoint, it's effectively made up?
Yeah, absolutely happens all the time. And I have to say, a perceived change in competence can be a valuable outcome of an intervention as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But only when that perceived outcome is greater than anything else that you could have done in that same amount of time. And that's where I'm arguing, hey, wait a second, we don't know that. We don't actually know of this, whether, if you do it in 10 athletes and 5 of them report that they feel quicker on the field, right? And because of that, they make more decisions or better decisions, etc., because they just have more, guts or whatever you might call it. Then I would say, well, if we would have done another intervention in that hour, 10 times that it took, would we have had a greater effect? And if you can't answer that, right, or if you have to answer it as perhaps if they would have had a nap, they would have had a greater training effect. If that's the case, then I don't think we can say that placebo effect is actually a reasonable reason to keep the cognitive training in the regular training program.
So to double down on the practical application side of this piece, do you have any, for those professionals who are in places like this, whether they are sport coaches, whether they are military leaders, whether they are cognitive performance folks working in the industry, is there, I'm guessing that the biggest thing you're going to say is get as close to near transfer as you possibly can, simulate the task. But what are your practical application recommendations for people when deciding what tools to use and how to use them?
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point. As a skill acquisition expert nowadays, that field is moving more and more towards representative task design. So you actually practice in circumstances in which the constraints during practice are sampled from the competition, right? And the way in which perceptual information and action in that cyclical manner is coupled has to be the same as in competition or as in combat, etc. But in many cases, that's not possible, right? We can't get completely close to a combat scenario. So what do we do then? We try and get as close as possible. But when that is too complex, what you can do is you can actually cut that task up into small subtasks that each of them still have representative design. For example, that might be, and I'm just using a sports example right now, in soccer or in football. If the idea is to play 11v11 and you want to train someone's decision making, then doing that in a 2 versus 1, 2 attackers, 1 defender scenario can still be really relevant. It has similar coupling of perceptual information and action. It samples some of the same constraints, not all, but some of the same constraints, pressure and all that other stuff from competitive environments, but it's not the real game. You break it down so you can get someone to have more repetitions. You can repeat it. Instead of touching the ball once during an 11v11 game, you can touch it 10 times now, 10 times as many decision-making moments, right? And that's really important for people to know, that we don't just go and say, well, if the aim is to fight a boxing match, all you have to do is fight really tough opponents all the time. We know that that's not possible. You break it down into segments, you train those segments, but what those segments look like is really important. For example, we know that in fighting from research, that the socio-affective components of fighting are really important. Right? If you never spar against good opponents, or if you always use safety gear, you're not actually training the same skill as when you're fighting a really good opponent or someone without safety gear, because you're going to get closer to them because you know you're less likely to get hurt. You're leaving some spots open because it doesn't really matter because you've got padding on, etc. Right? So you have to really think about what is the task that I want to transfer to, and how do I get as close as possible with a task that's as representative as possible. And I have to say, I've worked with some of the best coaches in the world. It's been really difficult because oftentimes, and I guess that's the same for Army, a lot of the people who design the practice, they design it because they're in this sort of mode of, I've done it like this, so we keep doing it like this because it worked for me, right? And they just keep using that same method over and over again, even though society changes, the way that we train changes, what we know changes. And I think for cognitive training, that might be much of the same, right? Maybe people did it when they were younger, and then they felt like they had some benefit, and then now they also do it with their players, and it becomes so ingrained that it's very difficult to argue against it. But I've had to do it many times. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not.
As you were talking, I got to thinking about this idea that in this space, and probably in other spaces too, but we see it in this one a lot, you hear these buzzwords like cognitive performance, and it's almost always coupled with acquisition of some kind of technology. Like you need to have a thing, whether it's an app or a software. But as you're kind of laying that out and using small-sided games in soccer, because I remember looking into this in graduate school, that's not billed as cognitive training, but really you could make the argument that it is. I mean, you're doing all the things that you want to enhance as an athlete in the game. You don't need a neuro tracker. You don't need sunglasses that blink lights at you really quickly. So is it maybe that the industry needs to have, kind of a discussion about what are we actually calling cognitive training? Do we rebrand some of the things we're already doing? And does the research kind of go in that direction? Or I guess from where you're sitting, have you already seen some of the research kind of tease that out?
Yeah. Why does it need to be isolated in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. Why do we need to isolate some aspect of performance as cognitive performance while it's really just embedded in context while you're doing other things? And I guess that's often something, the skill acquisition field is very, very small. So even though it's something that's talked about a lot now, the amount of researchers that do this work is very, very, very small. And a lot of them, and especially the younger ones, they're doing outstanding work in this area, right? And they're slowly getting to spaces where they actually say, and they can convince people and say, well, actually, if you want to train decision-making, don't put something in a video and put the athlete or the operative in front of the video and make them make decisions. Do it in the field, do it in a real environment, right? If the idea is for a tactical operations team to train how to enter a room, right, and clear a room, then start with 2 operatives, then add a 3rd one and a 4th one, just gradually add complexity, but keep everyone embedded within the same task. And that's cognitive training in itself, right? You're scanning the environment, you're inhibiting a response. Do I fire or do I not fire? You don't need to isolate that and put it on a screen to train it. It's expertise, we always say, is domain specific. That means an expert is only an expert in context. They are an expert in situ. If you don't put them in that context, they are no longer experts. They're actually training a different task. So you make a really good point, and a lot of the young skill acquisition researchers across North America, Australia, Europe, South America, they're making really good strides here, but our critical mass is too small to do that quickly. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
So I'm going to ask a slightly meta question here, and it gets at what you just talked about in terms of like the body of research and the fact that it's somewhat young. How, like, I'll give an example that sets this up, I think, and I'll come back to my real question. The Army worries a lot, and like other organizations, colleges, sports teams and stuff worry all the time about training people to not do various bad behaviors that they don't want, right? Whether it's like sexual harassment, assault kind of stuff, whether it's resiliency stuff, all those things. And the research is pretty clear. If you bring an outside expert in and they give an awesome briefing for an hour once a year, it's going to make no difference. Mm-hmm. That's been studied pretty solidly. However, and that's an easy to study type of intervention. It's discrete, it's measurable, whatever. On the other hand, if you like embed conversations like that in throughout and make it a part of the culture and reinforce it through leadership and things like that, it can make a difference. So somebody reading the literature might say, oh, well, this kind of training doesn't make any difference. But that's sort of the nature of a research environment where you're measuring a discrete intervention. The thing can work. You just have to embed it in other ways. So does the nature of research environments hamper how we measure the delivery of sports psychology or cognitive performance interventions? Does it miss some of that?
Absolutely. And for all those who think there's no more ivory towers, there definitely are ivory towers, and some people never come down from them. And I have to say, having worked in different parts of the world, that's something they do extremely well in Australia. We've got a lot of embedded students who work inside organizations. We call it gorillas in the mist, because it's similar, right? You're observing coaches, you're talking to them outside of practice, you're dropping a few bits of knowledge here and there. It becomes part of their regular vocabulary. It gets you in. All of a sudden, you get to do an intervention with real experts that you get to see what that intervention does. Sometimes you can't even publish it, right? For example, if you work for the NBA, oftentimes there are embargoes against publishing that work. But it does get you one step closer to having real experts do your intervention. That embedded work is vital. The only thing that I want to see more of is organizations like that opening up for people like us. But sometimes that's very difficult to do because they feel we come in to criticize their existing practices. And in a way we do, right? You have to be open to get feedback on that stuff. But we don't come in there to be only critical. Once we are embedded, we want to make it work. We want to get the best possible practice to occur, right? But you have to be willing to let us in, and if you're a coach and you're afraid that your 40 years of expertise and experience is questioned at some points, then that becomes really difficult. Even though we never say, it's useless to tell someone you've been doing it for 40 years, you've won all these trophies and awards, but you're doing it completely wrong. There's no point in that, right? We've really developed these really good methods of embedding ourselves and slowly making small changes, things that might improve the organization for the next 20 or 30 years. But again, that requires a critical mass. How many skill acquisition experts or specialists do you know who've trained for it, who are embedded within organizations like that? I know almost none, apart from my students.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we've had that exact same discussion on the strength and conditioning side specifically, where you see coaches who are doing things that are blatantly wrong effectively, but how can you say it's wrong if the athlete that they're coaching, has a bajillion gold medals or, whatever. So I'll ask you this in the same way that we've asked, some of the folks on that side. From what you've seen, who out there is doing this type of thing well? Because one that comes to mind, and I don't know if they're doing this well or not, but you see organizations like Red Bull, tout a lot of this mental cognitive type stuff. And I remember one of their directors years ago giving a talk about how, he would release a grizzly bear. I don't know if he actually did this, but like have an athlete run from a grizzly bear because it's super stressful and blah, 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 blah. So have you seen people that are doing this well? And as a caveat, second question to that, what are they doing?
Yeah, so there are organizations that are doing it really well. Some of those are NBA teams that have specifically, so what they are doing well is they're actually inviting this knowledge in through educational resources for their coaches. So they're basically saying, we'll design this suite of educational resources. It's specifically on how do we learn skills, or what is the value of cognitive training, or whatever it is, with really specific practical applications, which is like a bespoke education suite. I've designed those myself before. And by inviting that in and by keeping something that you can have for a longer time, every time you get a new coach in, right, who wants to be part of the senior team or part of the reserves team or whatever they are, they do this little suite that's sort of 4 weeks long, has some practical tasks, some general information. And the feedback that I'm hearing from there is that these educational resources slowly shift the thinking of the coaches. It can never be the goal of an intervention to change someone's behavior without them wanting it. It has to be an implicit change. It has to be something that they engage in and do, and they come to the realization and say, hey, wait a second, maybe, shooting 1,000 shots, over 3 days to get someone to shoot better is not the best way of going about things, right? Maybe there are other ways from, that we can borrow from science or practice that are better. And I see that happening a lot there. There's also, so what I've seen in the past, the high-level coaches that I've worked with, it was always them who invited me or us in. So it was never me going there and say, you need this. I know you need this, because it doesn't work, right? The best skill acquisition expert is a ghost. They're just somewhere during practice. You always kind of see a glimpse of them. They're always observing, but they're not, outspoken. They're not always, they're not critical in front of other people. They're observing, they're having a chat with the coach afterwards. And that can only happen when they invite you in. And I think that's an important tool.
So I had a question kind of planned out as to what's the best way to acquire a skill, but and you can take it in that direction, but as you're talking, it kind of brings to mind something similar that we see a lot in this space, which is with these teams, these multidisciplinary teams where you've got a cognitive performance specialist, a strength coach, an athletic trainer. How would you advise folks to combine those types of things? And specifically what I'm thinking about is we see a lot of energy and effort put towards how can I layer cognitive training into a PT session? Can I superset a back squat with a drill or whatever? Is that even a thing? And what would that even look like?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just so before I talk about that, I think when multidisciplinary teams come together, I think a shift is needed in what we understand as performance. If we say performance equals, and imagine this as a tree, right? You've got performance at the top, and then underneath you've got one side skill and the other side chance, right? Luck. We can't do anything about the luck part. Let's go to the skill part. When you start thinking about, let's say, conditioning as being able to produce skill under fatigue, the psychological side, being able to produce skill under stress, and you put skill more at the center of these performance models, it all of a sudden makes it much easier to build a multi-dimensional team around it. So that's one. And the second thing is, there's actually plenty of interventions that show, for example, that when you do certain physical tasks, and we've got a lot of this research running at the moment, right? And you use something called the dual tasking paradigm, which is basically you do a task without an additional cognitive task, and then you can do a task with a cognitive task. So 2 tasks at the same time, let's say squatting, and at the same time you're counting backwards in 9s from 103, something like that. That requires a lot of cognitive resource. That actually might also decrease the amount of attentional resource that's required for the primary task, right? Because all of a sudden you've only got a limited amount of cognitive space, let's say, there. If a lot of that's taken up by a cognitive task and you're training at the same time, you might make yourself more robust against stress, because what happens when you're stressed, your attention capacity decreases. Right? And all of a sudden, if the actual task that you've trained takes up less cognitive capacity because you've trained it with this additional task that takes up a lot of the cognitive capacity, then maybe it might be more robust under stress. And there's plenty of studies demonstrating that, for example, implicit learning, right, which is a method of non-rule driven learning. And I'll give you an example, right? It might be if you're teaching an old person how to fall, you could say, well, when you fall, you should put your elbow down and then your hip down and kind of try to lower yourself in a manner that you don't just bonk on the ground. Or you could say, try and fall more like a feather. This is unrealistic, right? But it's an analogy. And that analogy compresses the amount of rule-driven information you have to remember. because it compresses it, all of a sudden that allows for more attention capacity to be freed that you can then dedicate to the task at hand. So there's all kinds of different ways in which you can integrate cognitive, and I call this cognitive training, but they're really motor learning or skill acquisition paradigms, in which you can use them in physical training and actually get potentially a physical benefit from them. And lots of research, there's not that much in sport, but lots of research in the motor learning domain has demonstrated that you can use these interventions and they can be effective on the physical side, right, without improving, let's say, mental aspects.
So I'm going to underline something he just said for the audience, and it's going to take me into a question. Note that he did not say you just get generally more robust against stress. Like exposure to stress makes you better at handling stress, and we can apply that generally. What he said was that by making the task you're doing more cognitively efficient, requiring less of your focus to do it well, that leaves you more room to handle the stress. So it's almost the reverse of the way a lot of people think about it. And I'm gonna lead this into a tactical question because I see this all the time in terms of how do interdisciplinary teams incorporate this type of training into what they do. I'll set up a mildly funny example. I don't know if it's necessarily wrong or not. I'm just very curious about it all the time because it seems like FAR transfer. We're very interested in having people do cognitively demanding or fine motor skill demanding tasks while physically fatigued. And it's easy to set that up with a FAR transfer type of model where you do things like a card task or balancing something while you're tired and sweaty, or everybody's favorite lately seems to be do some sort of like anaerobically high intense thing and then use a pencil to balance nuts on top of each other. That seems like it relies on like a fuzzy understanding of stuff. How do we move that in a direction where we're like, because I saw one recently that seems much more like near transfer and actually requires zero resources whatsoever, which is you tire someone out and then just quiz them on things they should know about their technical tasks. And that could be as simple for like our military audience here, like, well, somebody's fatigued during a physical training session, ask that, like, go through a call for fire kind of scenario, or go through calling for a medevac, or what, like, those don't actually require anything other than like a script or a card. But that seems like it might carry over better to actual job performance than balancing random objects while you're sweaty.
Yeah. So first of all, these tasks are entirely different, right? One of the tasks is a motor component, while the other is a purely cognitive task, right? So you're asking someone to recite knowledge under fatigue. And that can be really useful because sometimes in the field, you need to recall knowledge really quickly. So near transfer seems logical to do it. If the idea is, for example, right, in the motor task, and I'm picking an example here without being part of any kind of or having little understanding on how military personnel actually trains. But imagine that it's something like reloading a rifle, right? And the idea is to get people to reload a rifle better under stress. And the only real way to do that is to often practice reloading a rifle under stress, under fatigue, under whatever it is, right? If you then balance these nuts under fatigue, right? If we take the principle of specificity, which most people listening to this podcast would understand, even just on a muscular level, right? The muscles that are working while you're balancing these things on top of each other, right? They are vastly different than the ones that are working when you're reloading a rifle. So even just on the principle of specificity, it doesn't work. But on top of that, it's the FAR transfer. If you get something like that to occur, I'd love to hear about it. But actually, the evidence is that would barely work. What it could do is make people maybe less panicky in stressful or fatigued scenarios, right? And they might have more composure. And some of that might transfer across when you're talking purely about the task, then I'm wondering why don't you just take the task that you want to target anyway? Why take some pseudo task? Maybe sometimes in sport, I say they use it because it looks good on Instagram, but I don't know if that's the same elsewhere.
Well, and I think we can all understand why this industry, I think, propped up. Like, it's like you mentioned, it's attractive to think that I could have my athletes on a plane traveling from one game to the next, and we could be on some device touching things, and now we're becoming more robust. Like, so my question for you is there is there a way to use some of that downtime where historically, and maybe the answer is they just take a nap, but like, is there a way that we could take some of that and have some transfer to the sport or activity? Like, is there any goodness at whatsoever in this type of approach, or is it all just a sham?
So if I take the train scenario, right, I would say that in the motor domain, there's probably nothing that you can do in that situation that is actually going to benefit you out on the field, right? Or if you're taking transport to, a battle arena or even a training scenario or a training camp or something like that, there's nothing you can do there. What you can do there is if your job requires some aspect of knowledge, you can train yourself to remember that knowledge better or in a different way or through an analogy rather than through rule-driven behavior, right? Something that we've all used when we were studying for exams, right? Is you take the first letter of every important sentence, you put them together and you make a word, right? That's a way to remember less information so that when you need to recall that information, you have less attention capacity available, then perhaps it might be easier to recall that. So if you're doing anything, I would say do something like that if it benefits your job. But remember that whatever you do there, it is probably only going to have a near transfer. So it has to be closely related to what you're eventually going to be asked when you're stepping off the plane, right? But there's nothing there that you can do. And I mean, I also understand it. I understand it that if players are on a plane for 5 hours and you can get them to do something useful, then that would be great. But in that case, I would say napping is useful. Relax a bit, spend some time with your teammates and have some fun, right? But don't go and try and train all kinds of motor activities that then don't actually do anything, because it frustrates players as well, because they can feel it. Like we always pretend, players or personnel, right, that they don't know, but they know. But they know when they're doing these tasks that it's not actually going to do anything. So they're not even if you really believe that it would be beneficial as a coach, probably your players aren't even that engaged in it anyway.
So this sets up a little bit of a sidebar that I was interested in. And if it's not something you've looked at, tell me to shut up and we'll move on with near far transfer kind of stuff. But as I tried to learn a little bit to prepare, and I want to know more about whatever mental skills, cognitive training, whatever it is, I did a little bit of reading, right? And one of the first things you stumble upon, and I remember getting this in like psych classes in college and stuff, is individual zones of optimal functioning, normal, inverted U, like Yerkes Dodson law, that kind of stuff. And it's treated as like foundational and absolutely true. But when I go look at it, Yerkes Dodson was 1908. It was Japanese dancing mice. And it was only cited like 5 times in the 100 years after it was published. But all of a sudden people are calling it a law. And there is some stuff more recent. I was pointed towards some work as like within the last 10 years or so that kind of backs it up to a certain degree. But the overall argument of the individual zones of optimal functioning, the IZOF stuff, is that different individuals have different arousal levels at which they learn better or retain tasks better. And I'm sure that's true to some degree, but it feels like it's much more about the task they're trying to learn. Is it gross motor skills? Is it fine motor skills? Is it memory? As well as how proficient are they in it? If they're learning it for the very first time, I bet lower stress level is going to be appropriate. If they're trying to make it unconscious competence where they can do it without thinking about it, a higher stress level is more like, am I on the right track here? Or am I crazy?
Yeah. So first of all, my work is nowhere near that work, but you've highlighted a few things which are really, really relevant. The first is that we tend to do this thing, right, where we go and look through the literature, and there's so much literature, right? And I'm talking, for people who don't know, there's millions and millions and millions of publications, right? And every year that increases exponentially. So we go and look for things, it's called confirmation bias, that actually confirm our intuitive thoughts, right? And it's so easy to do. I can write you something today that seems outrageous and find some sort of far-fetched evidence for it somewhere. And I think that's important to know, because it means that people have to be aware, and I've said this in the beginning as well, that not everything that is published is valuable. In fact, a lot of what is published is not valuable. And the more that's published that's not valuable, the more difficult it becomes to find the things that are published that are truly valuable, right? So, and discerning what is relevant and what is not is extremely difficult to do. Now, the second part there is more towards the individual learning part, or the individual aspects of skill. That is 100% true. When we look at skill learning, the first thing I teach my students is whatever you thought skill learning was because you read, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, or you heard about the 10,000 hour rule from your piano teacher, is actually not how skill learning works. Skill learning is on average, a negatively accelerated curve, which means you increase rapidly in the beginning, and then that slows down over time, or as you practice more. But a realistic individual curve looks very different, right? You might increase today, then you might practice as much tomorrow, but have no increase. And then the next day, you might have a regression in performance that brings you all the way back to where you started, even though you've already trained 3 days. Then you might train one more day and jump 3 days ahead in where you're supposed to be on the negatively accelerated learning curve. So learning is hugely individual dependent. On top of that, learning is very task dependent. For example, something that we know about learning is that early learning occurs with a lot of movement errors. And then I wrote some things about that earlier. So when you start learning, you make very large errors and you make them frequently. As a result, each time you overcome one of these errors, you get a massive jump in performance, right? Because think about a simple task, something as simple as trying to stop a stopwatch exactly at 0.05, right? Something like that. You make large errors in the beginning, but you overcome those errors and you quickly get better. But as you become more expert, the errors that you are making are much smaller and they occur much less frequently. And as a result, right, your learning improvements are also a lot smaller. So if you're an expert at something already, or if you're already highly skilled and you're starting to train, you can't expect the same effect from someone who's highly skilled, because the errors they're likely to make are small and infrequent. Therefore, if you compare these two learning curves, right, even without looking at all the sort of ups and downs and regressions, they don't even look the same, right? And these are some of the fundamental concepts that are required. And usually that's what I spend a lot of time on when we go into organizations, is to get people to understand these fundamental concepts. Because once you understand them, they open up a whole new field of practice, right? Oh, now that I understand how these error rates work, maybe I can use something called dynamic difficulty, which is like a dynamic adjustment of the difficulty, where if you're really good at something and you always, let's say, get successful trials, then you or the challenge of your task increases much more rapidly than when you're not good at something, right? And that opens up a whole new world of practice design. That's why oftentimes, skill acquisition people refer to themselves as practice designers, right? They're trying to help you design the most optimal practice scenarios, and that starts with some of these fundamental concepts. So I didn't answer your question whatsoever, but it did open up two possible things that are interesting to discuss.
Well, you led me back to something I think is really interesting, because this is taking me back to when I was a lieutenant in an infantry battalion designing training, right? And I don't think we ever would have described this as motor learning, skill learning, cognitive performance stuff at the time. We would have thought of it as just training, but we were doing the dynamic difficulty thing you talk about. When we put together platoon sticks, which is platoon situational training exercise, no live rounds, they're just like walking through the tasks. We had essentially a menu of additional stressors that could be added, and whether they got added was based on how the platoon was performing. So at various points over like the multi-hour or multi-day exercise, you would add in a layer of difficulty if they were performing very well, or you wouldn't add it if they were still working on figuring out the thing they were on already. And this kind of comes full circle what you're talking about before. Not all quote unquote cognitive stuff has to be separated out and use technology or be specific to a specialist in that domain. It can just be about informing the design of the types of training you're already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point to make. And I think we often see that when we go into organizations, right, we see that just through experience over time, a lot of these coaches, instructors, etc., they figure out what the most optimal ways of training things are. We see much more good things than we do bad things, right? So dynamical difficulty in this case is one, but I mean, it happens all the time. Anyone who's played, around the world in basketball understands what dynamical difficulty is, right? People use it all the time because they know it's a beneficial way of learning. It's about reinforcing those behaviors and telling the people that this is actually good. And if you want to expand on this, why don't you think about the optimal challenge point, which is a theory that tries to design the optimal point of or challenge or difficulty within a practice session for each single individual, right? So that might be the next step. So you can take your training even further. Dynamical difficulty, great, but let's take it a bit further. And here's what we need to do to get that done. So a lot of good stuff is already happening. And for sure, there's no point in viewing cognitive performance as an isolated part of performance, because in a game, in a battle scenario, in a practice scenario, whatever you are doing, it is also not, right? So why would we view it as separate in practice? It doesn't make any sense.
So mentioning that, I'm kind of coming back now to the near far transfer paper that you wrote about there not being any evidence for far transfer. And like we mentioned, it was a bit of a call out to the industry, or rather to the research body, to say that, like, we should probably call out some of these things. And so my question for you is, for this body of research, is it a net positive or net negative, or kind of neutral, this fact that we see this emergence of these consumer facing technologies that are doing things that they may or may not blatantly know are false? Does that overcrowd what you would say is good research, and does that then make it more challenging for folks that are doing good work in this space to have that voice heard? Or has, I guess, that ship already sailed and the consumer marketplace is just sort of latched onto this idea that I can download an app and play brain games while I'm sitting on an airplane?
Yeah, so we're probably fighting, like, I hate to say this, but I'm probably fighting a losing battle, right? But no, well, I mean, it doesn't matter that
Hey, we like you.
Yeah, I shouldn't give up, right? But I think it's a net negative, and the reason for that is, and a lot of my research mentors have instilled in me the same thing, is that when good things get buried under a mountain of bad things, they can be as good as you want. No one will ever find them, right? It can be a strategy. For example, lots of academics use that strategy. They publish a high volume of poor quality papers. And as a result, if you are in the same field as those authors and you write something that's reasonably good, the chances of it kind of surfacing are much smaller than when you're in a more high quality field. On top of that, we have to remember that my scientific work, right, when that comes out and that is published, that is reviewed by my peers. My peers are also the people, right, who have this confirmation bias and this cognitive dissonance. Not all of them, right, but some of them. So it makes it even more difficult for me if there's a large body of sort of poor quality work and I want to criticize it. It makes it extremely difficult for that work to come out because one of my peers is going to feel criticized, right? And they're going to try and stop this work from coming out. So it's an overall net negative, just because it's so difficult to fight this system. It's extremely difficult. And I mean, one of my mentors, and you guys being in strength and conditioning, you might know him, Franco Impellizzeri. He's really instilled in me that you should never give up, right? And the higher the quality of your work becomes, the more likely it will be seen by the right people. So if you have a mountain of bad work and your work is mediocre, it never gets seen. But if it's really, really, really good, it might shine, sort of in the heap of bad stuff. It might shine and someone might find it, and it sort of creates this snowballing effect, which you can never have otherwise. So I keep trying, and I keep, putting this kind of work out, and a lot more frequently now putting out work that's not even published in scientific journals. Like, I really don't care that much anymore. I'm putting my work out so people can read it for free, so they can find my thoughts somewhere. I do it for coaching magazines or anyone else, out there who's listening and says, I want to write something about this. Let's do it, because my sole aim now for the next couple of years, now that I don't have to really publish that much anymore, I don't have any pressure or anything from an employer, I can actually focus on getting more work out there, getting more of the good work to shine, putting some of these really good young researchers in the spotlight, because they're doing good work and they never get looked at just because of their age and their inexperience. So I'm hoping to be able to do that. This podcast, and I'm very grateful for it, but this podcast is a very good platform for it. I'm not a big sort of podcaster or someone who goes on podcasts frequently, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Drew, just brief meta comments on the whole podcast thing. One, at some point we're probably going to have to get Franco on the podcast, because Job is like the third or fourth person we've had on the podcast who has cited Impelazari as like a mentor in the research world and stuff like that. It's getting to be like a thing that comes up every few episodes now.
Yeah.
And I do want to know, I know we're going to like draw towards a close here, but I posted something on the Instagram page recently about the backfire effect. And you talked about your peers in the industry reacting badly when their work is criticized, but that's a natural psychological thing, right? The more closely you hold an idea, the more violently you're going to respond to that idea being challenged, whether or not the challenge is accurate or not. That's just something we have to keep in mind as we like seek more critical thinking kind of approaches to things. And I'll tell you for sure that if you have a podcast and an Instagram page where you like shout your opinions to the world, you experience a lot of backfire effect, and people are happy to tell you all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Especially when your podcast is like often about an organization that you're affiliated with, that it gets people mad all the time. It's a good time.
Yeah.
So as we do close it out, I guess my final question for you here is, where would you point people that want to learn more about these topics, especially if they're working on a team that is supposed to incorporate this kind of thing, or if they are a practitioner in the space? Where would you point them in terms of reading, finding resources, whatever it is?
Yeah, so I point all of them not to the sports literature. Don't go there. Go to the psychological literature. It's better. There's more support. There's also a bigger debate that you can read up on. The papers are written better. The quality of those papers is higher. If you like that and you want a kind of summary, read through my preprint. It's freely available. And you can have a look there. But first of all, go to Sala's work in the psychological literature and have a look there. And if that doesn't open your eyes, then I don't know.
And I can tell you the show notes for this episode might have the most citations of any episode we've done. Your preprint will be the top one on there. Sala's work will be in there as well. But as I started reading some of the stuff you sent us, I had to click on the citations from those things, and it takes you down a rabbit hole real fast. So there will be plenty of resources just on the show notes from this podcast itself.
Yeah. And of course, anyone who's interested in this topic can just find my name somewhere. You can contact me through the internet somehow, and we can discuss or talk about it. As I said, I just want to reiterate that my goal is to open a conversation, not just about cognitive training, but about skill training in general. And if you have questions, or you feel the field's kind of, you don't know where to start, it's too big and you don't know where to start, just drop me a line and we can talk.
Fantastic.
Job, I know you said that you're not a big podcast guy, but I will say unequivocally you crushed this one. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for opening. Again, for a lot of folks, this is probably a new space, definitely something that they don't have a lot of expertise in. So hopefully you get hit up so much that you reach back out and tell us to take your contact information off the website. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Hey guys, Drew and Alex here. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsandmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.
Thank you.